As you know, an Elasticsearch cluster consists of one or more nodes. Data is stored on shards, and shards are stored on nodes. Until now, every node that you've seen has stored one or more shards. A node will typically store shards, but it might not always be the case though. That's because each node can have one or more roles, defining what the node is used for. Let's take a look at the roles that are available. First up, we have the master role, which makes a node eligible for being the cluster's master node. We haven't talked about what a master node is yet, and I don't want to go into a lot of details now, because it's actually a quite complicated subject. Essentially, a master node is responsible for performing cluster-wide actions. This mainly includes creating and deleting indices, keeping track of nodes, and allocating shards to nodes. Giving this role to a node does not automatically make it the master node, unless there are no other nodes with this role. The reason is that the cluster's master node will be elected based on a voting process, so if you have several nodes with this role, either one of them may be elected as the master node. For large clusters, it's often useful to have dedicated master nodes. That's because having a stable master node is crucial for ensuring that the cluster is stable. If the elected master node is too busy doing other things, such as serving search requests, then cluster stability may be affected. Searching for data and modifying it is expensive in terms of hardware resources, so if you see high CPU, memory and I/O usage on your master node, then it might be time to add a dedicated master node. Next, we have the data role. As its name implies, this role enables a node to store a part of the cluster's data. Not only that, it also performs queries, such as search queries and modifications of data. Storage of data therefore goes hand in hand with serving queries that are related to the stored data. A node will typically have this role, especially for small to medium-sized clusters, but a node won't store any shards if this role is disabled. I mentioned that for large and busy clusters, there might be a point in time where it's useful to introduce dedicated master nodes. A part of doing that is to disable the data role for the master eligible nodes. You will then have other nodes that do contain the data role and not the master role. The main purpose of having dedicated data nodes is therefore to separate master and data nodes. The next role I will talk about is one named ingest, which enables a node to run ingest pipelines. That requires a bit of background knowledge. An ingest pipeline is a series of steps that should be performed when ingesting a document into Elasticsearch. Ingesting refers to adding a document to an index. The steps are formally referred to as processors, and they may manipulate documents before they are added to an index, such as adding and removing fields or changing values. An example would be to ingest a web server's access log, where each request is stored as an Elasticsearch document. We could then transform the visitor's IP address into geographical data such as latitude, longitude, country, etc. You can think of an Elasticsearch ingest pipeline as a simplified Logstash pipeline, as it provides a subset of the Logstash functionality. You can build fairly complex ingest pipelines that perform a lot of data transformations, but if you need the full functionality, then Logstash is the way to go. That being said, ingest pipelines are useful for relatively simple data transformations. If you're ingesting a high volume of documents, then running all of them through an ingest pipeline may be expensive in terms of hardware resources. Some of the Elastic Stack products ship with ingest pipelines. For example, if you use FileBeat to ingest Apache access logs, each line of the access log will be run through an ingest pipeline before being stored within an Elasticsearch index. As you might imagine, running a busy website or API will yield a lot of documents. That's why it's possible to enable or disable ingest pipelines for a node. If you run a lot of documents through a pipeline, you might consider having a dedicated node for this. If you intend to make use of machine learning, there are two settings related to this feature. The first one, named node.ml, identifies a node as a machine learning node if set to true. This enables the node to run machine learning jobs. The second setting is named xpack.ml.enabled, which enables or disables the node's capability of responding to machine learning API requests. If you make use of machine learning, then these two settings enable you to run dedicated machine learning nodes. That might be useful if you don't want your background machine learning jobs to slow other things down, such as search requests. The next role is coordination node. By coordination, I'm referring to how Elasticsearch distributes queries internally. We haven't talked about how queries are routed and coordinated yet, but we will soon. For now, just know that a so-called coordination node is a node that's responsible for processing a request and handling the delegation of work needed in that process. To be clear, such a node does not search any data on its own. Such work is delegated to data nodes. Having a node only serve as a coordination node is actually not possible through a single setting, because there's no role available for doing so. Instead, this is accomplished by removing the other roles from a node. All that's left then is the coordination of queries. Having dedicated coordination nodes is only really useful for large clusters, as it can essentially be used as a load balancer. The last role is one that I will just name drop. It's called voting only. I won't go into detail with this role, because the chances that you will ever need this role are close to 0%. What it basically does is that a node with this role will participate in the voting process when electing a new master node, but it cannot be elected as the master node itself. This role is only useful for large clusters. So which roles do our nodes actually have? You have actually seen that before, but I just didn't mention it. Let's head over to Kibana and take a look at the nodes within our cluster. There are two columns of interest to us, node.role and master. The first column specifies which roles a given node has. The roles are abbreviated, so DIM is short for data, ingest, and master. As you can see, all of our nodes have these three roles, meaning that these are the default roles that are used unless configured otherwise. This also means that all of our three nodes are eligible to be elected as the master node. In this case, the first node was chosen as the master. That's because it's the first node that was started up, and since there were no other nodes available at that point in time, that node had to become the master. That's also why you saw me checking the output of the first node when adding additional nodes to the cluster in the previous lecture. Now that you know which roles are available, let's talk a bit about when you will want to change them. As with determining the optimal number of shards that an index should have, the answer is that it depends. That being said, modifying the roles of nodes is almost always something you will do for large clusters and not small ones. Besides the size of the cluster, you will typically also want to do this when you need to scale the throughput of the cluster, i.e. when hardware usage is high. You will commonly want to tweak the number of shards and nodes first, however. Another reason for changing roles for a large cluster is just that it makes it easier to understand how the hardware resources are being used and optimize your cluster based on that. As a rule of thumb, you shouldn't change any roles if you don't know what you're doing, or if you don't have a good reason for doing so. This is something that can always be done at a later point, so you will almost always want to stick with the default roles until you need to change them. This also means that the purpose of showing them to you is not for you to go ahead and change the roles, but just for you to be aware of the possibility of doing so, in case you ever need to.